Well, good evening. I'm Patricia Van Skyke, and I'm director of the Lloyd Library. For folks that arrive late, we know where they'll get to sit. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, The Botanical Color Line in Slave Societies, Plant Illustration in the 18th Century Caribbean with Mark Harris. So Mark was our 2023 Artist in Residence. And we're really pleased by the fact that since we instituted the Artist in Residence program several years ago, we've been pleased to award the residency to applicants of Mark's stature and talent, who make the connection between research and the creation of art. Tonight's lecture is the culmination of his research here. But as you know, research never ends. It's never complete. So we continue to see Mark regularly as he digs deeper and continues his study conceptually and through his art. The works that Mark explores tonight are among the earliest published works about plants in the Americas, and some of the most highly regarded and treasured books worldwide. However, Mark's research is not confined by those parameters, as he recognizes the illustrations for their beauty and their accuracy, but with a great understanding of the slave societies and the colonial regimes underpinning them, and often integrated into their creation and production. Mark is a professor of art at the University of Cincinnati. He has an MA in painting from the Royal College of Art in London and a Ph.D. in philosophy from Goldsmiths College, also in London. His artwork and writings concern the visual culture and literature of intentional communities and avant-garde groups. And I would be remiss if I didn't add that he is a super nice guy and all of us at the Lloyd have had the great pleasure of getting to know. With that, I'd like to introduce Mark Harris.
Thank you, Patricia. I'm told I'd speak really quietly, and I know I'm mic'd up, but just shout if you can't hear me, and maybe we can. Does the mic sound all right, Erin?
Yeah, I hear.
Okay, great. I first of all want to thank the staff at the Lloyd Library. Well, thank you all for coming. It's fantastic to see many familiar faces and many new ones too. But thank you so much for coming out on a Thursday evening, right? I want to thank the Lloyd staff, particularly Patricia and Aaron Campbell, who invited me to the residency in the first place, who interviewed me and selected me for it. I was here for 3 months in the last fall. I'd like to thank Alex Hairline, who's not here tonight, but he's the first person at the Lloyd I met. He's helped me with the early research I did pre-COVID into the African plant diaspora. I'd like to thank Christian Jankowski for taking me out for coffee when I first arrived. That was really a nice welcome. And for Patrick Ford, who's here at the back, for many conversations about rock and roll. And if proof were needed, all botany leads to punk rock, and that's embodied in Patrick, though. So I'm talking about a complicated subject, one that's can be approached in many, many different ways. And I'm just choosing a sliver of scholarship, a sliver of an idea to talk about some aspects of these books. But I do want to just remind you that I am an artist and I do watercolors, and I went to Jamaica and I photographed botanical exhibits, and I brought the images back to America, and I did watercolors here, much like the artists that we're going to talk about. So in a sense, there's history repeating itself, particularly when you know that my ancestors were slave owners on Nevis, and I've been to Nevis to do research into the family history, and to some extent all of this work is in some sense an accounting for that very challenging background. I also did a drawing watercolor about the African plant diaspora, documenting all the plants that were transported during the 300 years of the Atlantic slave trade to the Americas. And we'll be doing a symposium next year around this subject with speakers will be coming in from outside. Speaking of maps, well, these are the four writers, illustrators that I want to talk about. And here they are kind of in chronological order. Hans Sloane, the first of all to visit the Caribbean of these four. He was in Jamaica towards the end of the 1600s. Maria Sibylla Merian, who was in Suriname. Mark Catesby, there's no portrait exists of Mark Catesby, strangely.
He was described by just Sayers.
Yeah, the man without a face. And he was in, his book is actually called Journey to Carolina, before Carolina was divided into two. But he also managed to get to Florida and the Bahamas. Florida then was a Spanish colony. And John Stedman, who was, so these were largely botanists, we would say. Stedman was a mercenary, and he is the odd one out here who went to Suriname for different reasons, but ended up engaged with botany in Suriname. So where were these people working? Here is an early map that Catesby includes in his book. And you can see Catesby was being a Brit, was more on this later, but he was sent to this region to do botanical work in support, to some extent, of the colony in South Carolina. And he was in that area at the top, which is generally known as Carolina, but included Georgia, South Carolina, north of Florida. Florida is brown there because it was a Spanish colony. And the British colonies are in pink here, the most prominent of which is Jamaica, the bottom center, which was the richest colony, the richest British colony at the time, and also a crucial strategic island for the British. And the Leeward Islands, so-called, see if they're on this map. Yeah, so the easternmost islands, the smaller islands you see there to the east of the Dominican Republic, where my ancestors lived, Nevis, and they're also the subject of one of the books I'll talk about in a minute. And here at the bottom you can see Suriname, where two of our writers traveled. And in the very bottom, outlined in pink, it's actually called, in this, I think, the Netherlandish Guinea, I think. And if I superimpose a contemporary map, you can see that it's adjacent to French Guiana and Guyana. Guyana, in that period, was eventually known as British Guiana. And the early map is slightly inaccurate, so Trinidad and Tobago is further northwest, and they've positioned it there. So I want to clarify a couple of terms. What was a slave society? Well, in the 17th and 18th centuries, when our illustrators and writers were working, the slave society was referred to or indicated those white settler communities who forcibly captured and transported Africans to the Caribbean or to the Americas for forced labor under conditions of draconian threats and torture. And their position was at the very bottom of a racial hierarchy that determined the lives on the islands. If you were white, you had access to all sorts of opportunities, no matter what your status or wealth. If you were black, you had none at all, and if you were manumitted, your opportunities were similarly severely limited. And for botanists writing on this area, I mean, we look into the nuances here, but for some of the botanists, the Native Americans, indigenous peoples, and Africans were a part of natural history rather than considered a subject to be studied in themselves with their own histories. And so Elsa Govai, who's a very important Jamaican historian, she was born in Guyana. She was a very talented school student. She earned a scholarship to a British university and did her Ph.D. in England. But when she returned to the Caribbean, she was the first black historian in the University of the West Indies in Kingston, Jamaica. And her focus was really on looking at how to research and define histories that of the experience of black people in the Caribbean outside of colonial influences and colonial impact. She was also the first to advocate that the Caribbean identity could be researched and understood through the study of patois. Particularly, she said that you'd find it in calypso music, but also through various kinds of folk art. But her focus was language and history. And she also came up with one of the first active definitions of a slave society in her book on the Leeward Islands, including Nevis, where my family ancestors live. And she says all the whites, whatever their station in society, were united in their superiority to other groups. The West Indian whites believed that the Negroes were either an inherently inferior race or at the very least culturally backward in comparison with Europeans. And another writer I highly recommend, Campbell Brathwaite, originally Edward Campbell Brathwaite, fantastic Barbadian poet who died very recently, also a talented school student, earned a scholarship to Cambridge University, and once he finished there, he then moved to Ghana and taught for 10 years in Ghana before returning to the Caribbean, and he also taught at the University of the West Indies, but he was teaching literature, not history, but he's part historian, part poet, part folk culture, part theorist, part Caribbean theorist, very, very interesting writer. And from this book, he again elaborates on Gavaya's definition of slave society, and he was very influenced by Gavaya's writing. And he writes, white attitudes to slaves and to slavery were therefore in a subtle, intimate manner also white attitudes and sentiments about themselves. They simply looked into a black mirror of subordinate flesh, but the general and overwhelming assumption was that slaves, if human, were of a different genus, that they were lazy, lying, profligate, promiscuous, etc. Brathwaite quotes a few times in his book this writer, Maria Skinner, who was actually born in New Jersey, but she married into a kind of British aristocracy. She married a British general high up in the military who was posted to the Caribbean before being posted to India, and she kept a diary. And it's very readable. She's a very empathetic person. She's very interested in the conditions under which people are living in the Caribbean. But she found herself in a situation that really demonstrates how concrete were these roles that people were obliged to play or occupy in a slave society. And she's invited by her hosts, these Murphy sisters, to an outdoor dance. And the first thing she does is she invites an elderly African man, an enslaved man, to open the dance. And her hosts are absolutely horrified by this. They told me afterwards that they were nearly fainting and could hardly forbear shedding a flood of tears at such an unusual and extraordinary sight. For in this country and among slaves, it was necessary to keep up so much more distant respect. They seemed to think the example dangerous, as making the blacks of too much consequence or putting them at all on a footing with the whites, they said might make a serious change in their conduct and even produce a rebellion in the island. And so this, no matter how empathetic you were, or even if you were an abolitionist, you were locked into these roles in these societies, and until the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, as the British were concerned, and then finally the abolition of slavery in the 1830s, there was very little opportunity for variance within that kind of regime. And so just a survey of the numbers here, which I find always terrifying, and perhaps the statistics are too cold, but in Jamaica before Sloane arrived, so the British won Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655, and between then and when Hans Sloane arrived in 1687, there were 35,000 captives imported from Africa, just to Jamaica. Now, while Sloane was there in Jamaica, in the 2 years he was there would have been 2,000 or 3,000 more that were brought in. And between his departure in 1688 and his death in 1753, a further 150,000 would have been brought in. And it is estimated between the foundation of the colony in 1655 and the end of the slave trade, Atlantic slave trade, in 1807, 1 million would have been brought into Jamaica, of which 200,000 would have been traded on to other islands or other colonies. So shocking statistics. In Suriname, of course, no better in any other colony, but in Suriname, 1697, around the time when Marion arrives, Maria Sibylla Marion, there are only 450 white people and 5,000 slaves. But between 1670 and 1820, 350,000 more captives arrive, and the number of plantations increases from 50 to 200. And Carolina splits into North and South Carolina in 1712. In South Carolina in 1720, there were 12,000 enslaved people and just 5,000 white. And 20 years later, there were 30,000 enslaved people and 15,000 white. Georgia's a little different because it didn't become a separate state until 1732, but it outlawed slavery until 1750 because it was very concerned that escaped slaves would flee to Florida, where they were provided they fought for the Spanish, would be guaranteed their liberty. And so the English administration in Georgia didn't want that to happen until they were pressured by the colonizers themselves to legalize slavery in 1750. And between 1750 and 1775, the number of enslaved increased from 500 to 18,000. And of course, it's estimated that during the course of slavery in the United States, about 10 million black people were enslaved during the 300 or so years up to the Civil War. So the numbers are astonishing, and it's just astonishing too that so many of the writers or visitors to the colonies overlook what's going on, or have to overlook what's going on, because it's kind of required or expected by their sponsors. So the other term I want to clarify is the botanical color line, and I borrow this, or adapt it from Jennifer Lynn Stover's book, The Sonic Color Line. And then Stover is talking about the silencing of black voices historically, where whites will not attend to or not listen to requests for help, requests for empathy and sympathy, and that and she writes of blacks feeling tuned out, dismissed, and misheard by the listening ear. It silences black people within it while enabling white people outside to ignore them. And here she's citing a wonderful retelling of Plato's Myth of the Cave by W.B. Du Bois, where Du Bois, writing in his book Dusk of Dawn, provides this image of a throng of black people in a cave appealing to the white passers-by who ignore them or don't hear them. And as they become more vociferous, they realize that, well, they're not being heard, and perhaps there must be a glass panel, glass plate that's separating the two groups. And as they become more gesticulating, they start to be laughed at and mocked until when they finally manage to break through the glass, they terrify the white people outside, who then are reduced to a state of violence and anxiety. So I want to transfer this concept to the botanical color line, where because of the stigmatization of enslaved people and Native Americans and indigenous people in the colonies, their botanical expertise was discounted. They were, of course, had been growing plants, tending plants, developing medicinal uses for plants for centuries, and they were relied on by the botanists we're looking at here for advice for identifying plants, for sourcing plants, for going into the forest and getting plants out of the forest as samples. They were also, to some extent, respected for the treatments, sometimes, as we'll see. But they were never able to cross that botanical color line and become respected botanists in their own right, respected for their expertise. And so I see this happening again and again. And in these accounts I look at, I want to draw out those moments when we hear the voices of the enslaved coming through the accounts, in spite of all of the, as we say, in spite of all of the neglect and silencing, and by this sense, try to cross the botanical line, or invite the sense of that these actually were experts on whom all the botanists relied for all of their work, and without whom they could not have done their work. So here are the four again, and I just want to say, if it's not too frivolous, to suggest it's like a hand of cards. So Sloane the King, when he returned to England, he did become the president of the Royal Society eventually, and his collection was also constituted the founding of the British Museum. And Mary and Catesby's books were widely acclaimed as being very significant botanical records. John Stedman, definitely the joker. He's the only one of the four who explicitly speaks out against slavery and the treatment of slaves in Suriname. But then he wasn't being sponsored by people involved in the colonial enterprise. He was a soldier, and yes, he had to be somewhat careful with how outspoken he was in Suriname. But what he said about the treatment of slaves was really extraordinary for the time. He was also extremely mischievous too, in his really badly behaved in his regular life, but extraordinary individual. And so these books are ones that I worked on here in the library. They're really important books that are held here. The Catesby is Catesby and the Marian are stars of the library collection. And here are the title pages of the four books. And I just want to point out the lag, sometimes the time lag between the research or the visit to the Caribbean and the publication of the book. In Sloane's case, it took him almost 20 years to get the first volume out, and 20 years further for the second. And one of the reasons for that would be I mean, these are big books. Sloane's book has 2 volumes, 500 pages in each. And so he was commissioning illustrations. Sloane did none of the illustrations himself, but did all the research himself, all the writing. Marianne was quite fast out of the blocks because she was working with her 2 daughters and could do all the drawings herself and the coloring herself as well. But she selected outstanding printmakers back in the Netherlands when she returned. Catesby likewise was quite fast because he was able to issue the book in sections. So he 11 sections altogether, but it still took him almost, 15 years to get the whole series out. And it allowed him then to issue one section, raise revenue for the succeeding one, and also generate more interest from subscribers. And then Stedman again took an age to get that book out. But there were a number of controversies around the book, and he was, by that stage, a married man with a family, and the diary that he kept in Suriname had to be really tidied up because it was full of scurrilous details about his sexual life in Suriname, and was full of invective against the army, against the colonizers as well. So examples of pages from the books. Sloane's is always a monochrome book, was always a monochrome book, as far as I'm aware. Marianne's exists in monochrome and color, hand-colored, and the library has both versions, as well as the 1730 edition, which is colored. Mark Catesby, again, black and white and colored. And the prices varied between them, because generally the price of the colored versions was double that of the monochrome. The Stedman also exists in black and white and color, but the library has a black and white version. So Sloane's book is, they're all extraordinary. Sloane's book contains a lot of illustrations of natural species and strange objects he finds, but it's primarily of drawings of plants and animals, of those probably 90% of plants. And the book opens with 3 unusual illustrations that some commentators have made a lot out of. And here's a land crab that was actually a vital source of protein for enslaved people living on the coast, and a pottery shard from indigenous peoples long before the colonizers arrived. And some have made the claim, and I'm inclined to be sympathetic to it, that these are an allegory of everything that Sloane can't talk about, but might like to. Sloane had spoken disparagingly of black music and music by enslaved peoples, but he reproduces 2 of their instruments here. And he speaks about it being a pagan and Bordean lewd kind of music, but he juxtaposes it here with what may not be Christian iconography, may or may not be an indication of punishments for enslaved people. And then the third of these the illustrations follow one another at the start of the first volume. And here's a Portuguese man of war, which could be emblematic of the warships that patrolled the Caribbean during the conflicts over the islands. And there are several coins here that are encrusted in coral, which were salvaged from a wreck, and a ship's timber too. And so again, a testament to the wealth of the Caribbean, but also the wars and violence that generated that wealth. He was sponsored by Lord Albemarle, who he employed Sloane to be his doctor in Jamaica. So they traveled out together on the boat, and Albemarle made another fortune from salvaging a wreck, probably the wreck from which these items came. He used enslaved divers who had the skill to, what's it called, free diving, I think, to salvage these items from the wreck. And they were paid a premium for doing it. They were very, very skilled. So in a way, it's also a testament to the conditions of his employment. Sloane's book is valuable also for the medical accounts he gives. The book starts out with a record of 128 treatments of people throughout Jamaica, and he's being employed by slave owners to examine their slaves, but he's very indifferent to who he treats, and it's an important account because it's the first account of European medicine being used in the Caribbean. And unlike other contemporary doctors of his, he's a person who wanted to be treating a patient by the patient's bedside rather than bringing theories or methods that were external to a one-on-one encounter. So he interviews the patient, he interviews their family, and he tries to get an idea of the circumstances in which they're ill. And we find this sympathetic. It involves a lot of, subjected him to a lot of criticism when he returned home because he was accused of not having a proper medical theory and method behind his approach. But he's surprisingly empathetic. And on one occasion here, I reproduce this because he's treated by a black woman who's celebrated for her medical abilities. And so he says, well, and he asks her to treat an infection in his foot, which turns out to be a chiga or chigo infection from a flea that lays its eggs under your skin and has to be extracted and then treated. And he says, I had a Negro famous for her ability in such cases to look upon it, who told me it was a chigo. She, who had been a queen in her own country in Africa, opened the skin, and then she when she's extracted the egg, she treats it with tobacco ashes from a pipe, which I do find quite ironic because Sloane would never, of course, have used anything as immediate or to hand as that to treat an injury. Occasionally he names the person he's treating. Here he treats a black woman called Rose, who was a housekeeper and looked after children. And for some reason she's become unable to move, unable to do any work. So she's handed a broom, she doesn't know what to do with it. And this sort of catatonic state is one that her owner wants treated. He writes, she would not speak to anybody, would not eat or drink except when forced, and if she were bid to do anything, she would forget what her commands were. And I suppose I like to think of this as a certain kind of vocalization. You know, was she resisting the task that she was required to do? Was this a kind of Bartleby position, rather not doing the work? Was she on strike in some way within, as much as was possible, within the regimes of slavery? Sloane treats her by, he cups her, which was to introduce burns in the body, which was one of the healing methods. He scarifies her in her neck. He orders a very strong purge to encourage her to vomit, force down her throat, and he says this did not work, not surprisingly. And then in a month's time, he writes, there was much alteration for the better, so that she was concluded not to be bewitched by her own country people. This, I think, is one of the most important statements in this passage, because the anxieties of the colonizer about Obeah, which was the syncretistic African, if we call it religion or system of superstitions and magic, which was very much respected by enslaved people, was really frightened the colonists because Obeah was a way in which enslaved people communicated with each other. It was a culture that was entirely separate from the regimes of slavery. And it had also been blamed for various slave uprisings. So Obeah doctors had been at the center of some uprisings in Jamaica in the past and had been accordingly punished or executed in a very cruel manner. And so this mention of witchcraft here, mention of these superstitions, it indicates how active the beliefs were, how active the dependency on Obeah doctors was. And that Sloane, of course, doesn't believe in any of this. But then he concludes that, well, this behavior is attributed by the common people to witchcraft or the power of the devil. And he says, she being very hard, as all mad people are, to work on, and by the use of these medicines alternatively, she came to herself and went about her business and got well. So he claims that he cured her, but in fact, obviously it was a far more complex process. He cites other enslaved people by name, but it's rare. Hercules, a lusty black overseer. Lusty in this case means energetic, fit, healthy, and a doctor. So I think this is interesting. Again, he's crediting, besides the African queen, he's crediting other enslaved people for their medical knowledge. Sadly, that Hercules was acclaimed amongst whites and blacks for his ability to treat gonorrhea. But he was unable to treat himself. And so Sloane starts to treat him for gonorrhea, but he leaves Jamaica before he can effect a cure. And then generally Sloane is fairly disparaging towards indigenous medicine, and he writes, well, there are many such Indian and black doctors who pretend to understand cures, but they don't perform what they pretend, unless in the virtues of some few simples, meaning herbal remedies. Their ignorance of anatomy, diseases, method, which is exactly what Sloane was trained in when he was studying at university in Britain and France. The ways to become a doctor involved botany, surgery, and anatomy, renders even that knowledge of the virtues of herbs not only useless, but even sometimes hurtful to those who employ them. So here again, these doctors are pushed to the other side of the botanical color line and are refused access to the credits and approbation that someone like Sloane would give them. So much after the medical section, so I had 128 diagnoses and treatments out of the hundreds altogether that Sloane dealt with in Jamaica. He talks about plants. He collects plants, and he's really focused on them largely for their medicinal properties. And so in this, this is a plant that he says is, the leaves are boiled and taken for stomachache. But this is ricinus, this is castor oil, which is also it can be very poisonous. And then an entry like this for Yaruma de Oviedo, a plant that's named after another botanist. I just put this here because it's interesting that for Sloane, this book is also a literature review. He's including all sorts of research that other doctors have done, and he does this so that he wants the book to be of value to doctors in the future. He sees in visiting the future of the book, but he also wants the treatments that he's listing to continue to be used and evaluated in Jamaica. But the diagnosis here, or the account of how this herb is used, is we cannot imagine that Sloane actually believed this. So and this researcher, Peter Marta, and I think a Portuguese researcher, they talk a story of an old Indian curing a very great wound whereby an arm was almost severed. But but this is a story at second hand already, and then Sloane's third hand. And this is very often how this evidence gets circulated at this time. And he goes on to cite Oviedo here. So in this way, the book is, as I say, a kind of literature review. So now let's move on from Sloane to Maria Sibylla Merian. And Merian is spends 2 years in Suriname. We also wonder, how did these people get into the position of being able to make these journeys, to have the skills even to be able to do this work? Well, Merian was born into a family of engravers and artists, some of them drawing flowers, painting flowers. Her father was an engraver for a family that produced a very famous book in 1590 called the India Occidentalis, which documented, often in very gruesome ways, the Spanish conquest of the Americas. And so she would know that book and been familiar through the book with the region, and that might have piqued her interest. Her brothers taught her intaglio printing, and her mother's second marriage was to a flower painter, actually Jacob Marel, who did the portrait we saw of Merian earlier, and who taught her painting, but most likely watercolor painting, because women at that time, at least in Germany, were not allowed to sell oil paintings. But from her late 20s, she was already breeding caterpillars to better understand the process of metamorphosis, which was her entomological focus, and she married a painter. So entirely immersed in those skills. At a certain point, she left her husband and joined the Lapidist sect in northern Holland, and this was a sect which forbade her from painting. So whether her move there was because she had a half-brother there or because she wanted to get away from her husband is not clear. She was allowed to continue with her entomological research but not to paint. And so eventually she may have become really frustrated with that, and she moved with her 2 daughters to Amsterdam. But the Lapidist connection was important for her because the Lapidists owned a plantation in Suriname. And so she got to Suriname partly because her elder daughter married a man who was trading with Suriname. And And so in a sense, the path was laid out for her. Suriname was a Dutch colony. She knew the language, and she had important connections there. And she writes of her motivation for going there that although she saw many collections of insects in Amsterdam, nobody was clear about how these insects reproduced, how they metamorphosed, and no one was clear about which islands or which region they came from. So she wanted to go and find out for herself. So again, this kind of intellectual curiosity is one of the motivations. And it's likely that she had already published 2 books on caterpillars and butterflies by the time she went to Suriname. So she was already a well-known illustrator and botanist. So this was important because she would have had to raise a lot of money to make that journey. And she sold work and to finance the journey, take her and her youngest daughter with her, and to pay for 2 years there because she was not employed while she was there. And I just singled out some of the, and this is an incredibly beautiful book, and I singled out some of the images that indicate a knowledge of or dependence on knowledge from indigenous enslaved people in Suriname. And in this case, she says, well, this cassava is used to bake bread that the Indians and the Europeans ate in the Americas. Sometimes she's very critical of the colonizers for their willed ignorance of botany. And she says, well, all they're interested in is sugar. And they're not at all, they can't tell her anything about the plants that she's discovering. And if they were interested in other plants and other fruits, like this American cherry, they would have other means of income. And here she says the caterpillar, worm she calls it, at the very top of the image there, was brought to her by a black female slave who told her, informed her, that beautiful grasshoppers would come from the pupae. So this is again an instance of somebody bringing knowledge to one of the botanists and indicating that absolute reliance these researchers had on indigenous and enslaved people. This is a plant she doesn't have a name for. I can't find a name for it because, as she says, nobody, the people there, the Dutch planters, do not feel like investigating something like that. Indeed, they mocked me for looking for something other than sugar in the country. But she also says that she couldn't, she relied on somebody in India, and she says to go into the forest and dig up the plant and bring it back and plant it in her garden. And then at the very end, it's a very important account, I think, because she says, look, and you imagine somebody wearing a dress. I mean, for a start, it was very rare for a woman to be engaged in this work at this time. But she said, because the forest is so densely grown with thistles and thorns, she had to send her slaves ahead of her to cut through the undergrowth to access the plants that she wanted to find. So, of course, her exposure to plants in Suriname was limited by the density of the forest and by the challenges of navigating these areas. And this was a region that, even at this time, was occupied also by Maroons, who were escaped slaves, who had set up communities in the forest, and who were continually fighting, killing and taking property from the planters who were on the very outskirts of the colony. So it wasn't always safe either. A peacock flower was important in the Caribbean because it's an abortifacient. And she writes here of the peacock flower saying, and this again is an indication of some empathy she feels towards the indigenous and enslaved people. She talks about the Indians, indigenous people who were not treated well when in service with the Dutch, and so they used this plant to abort their children, not wanting their children to be slaves like them. And at the very end of this passage, speaking about Africans from Guinea and Angola, indeed, they sometimes even kill their children because of the harsh treatment commonly inflicted on them, because they feel that the children will be reborn in a free state in the country of their friends, as she heard from their own lips. So there's a first-hand account in this case. So just to conclude the Marianne account, this is a really extraordinary image in the book. And I like to see this, it shows spiders attacking ants, attacking butterflies, ants attacking spiders. It's an image of extreme predation. And perhaps again, as I talked about the Sloan images earlier, this is one way in which she is able to represent the violence in the Caribbean without being explicit about it. She was criticized for this depiction because as when she got home, people said, well, there's no spiders that kill hummingbirds. And it wasn't until, I think, the 1800s that she was proved correct. And nor were there spiders ants creating ant bridges, but of course we know that to be true as well. And here's a further detail, just to show you the quality of some of the line work and painting in all these images. It wouldn't be fair without leaving you with some other details of Marianne's work in that book. And extreme close-up with gold highlighting them. So one thing, this is the frontispiece to the 1830 edition. And right in the middle there, you can't really see her very well here, but I'll show you a close-up, is Marianne herself bent double catching butterflies. But this is an allegorical image of Marianne here on the left. And just take note of that open book on the ground there at the extreme left, because that represents, right, the image we just saw, but also another outstanding image in the book. But they are not juxtaposed in the real book, because as you know, it's always text and image. So for the purposes of this allegorical image, they're juxtaposed. And here's the detail of Marianne in the middle here. But this, I think, is a perfect encapsulation of a slave society, because on the right you have either the administrators, Dutch administrators, or plantation owners looking skeptically at what Marianne is doing. And in front of her is a little casket in which she put the specimen she catches. But on the left are two enslaved people, and they're working. So they're carrying goods. They may well have been employed, or people like them employed as porters for Marianne. And so I think this is a perfect depiction of a slave society. And here's Marianne, and again the net is ringed in gold, and it's the perfect center of the image, laterally, not vertically. But so moving to Catesby. So Catesby was not an educated botanist like Sloane. He did not have, nor did he have the skills that Marianne had. He didn't grow up in an artist family. And it's a little obscure how he got to know about botany. But it seems he had encouraged, he was mentored, I think, by family friends. He grew up in Essex, just northeast of London, and complained, he's just one of the reasons for going to the Caribbean, he complained that he was too far from London to really engage with the intellectual circles that would have stimulated his interest. So he wanted to go to, he said, he recorded a passionate desire to travel to where these specimens originated that people were discussing. He first went out, and so, these are privileged people. A sister of his was traveling to Williamsburg, Virginia, so he accompanied her, and he stayed there at first for 7 years. He moved in 1712. When he was 29, he goes out with his sister and doesn't return until 1719. And he's quite scornful of his time there. He says, well, I wasted my time, really. Some of the accounts show him spending a lot of time drinking with friends he met. But he did travel up the James River and did some research and collected specimens. He was occupied in advising American gardeners on how to arrange the plants. He was sending plants back to England, particularly to Peter Collinson, who was really influential in the garden movement in the early 1700s. But he did not, and he did sufficient number of drawings to when he returned in 1719, he was able to generate a lot of interest in his work, sufficient to get sponsorship to return to America, to the Carolinas, in 1722, when he spent 4 years there working very hard. But he returned with sponsorship from members of the Royal Society, and he was invited to also go there by the governor of South Carolina, Francis Nicholson. And for Francis Nicholson, Catesby was a valuable, agent or employee. Nicholson needed intelligence about the interior. It was only 6 years earlier that the Yamasee War had ended, which had nearly wiped out the colony. So there was a confederacy of Indian nations who had fought against the British, largely on the side of the French. And the British only succeeded because the Cherokee came over to the British side against their former enemies. And it remained the Cherokee and the Chickasaw Native Americans who helped Catesby in his search for plants when he was doing those 4 years. Now, without their help, without their knowledge, he couldn't have done anything. And he wasn't able to go into areas in which they were not themselves, did not feel safe. And so much of the region was still occupied by hostile groups. And so in a way, again, like Marion, he only had access to a part of the country. So what he's representing is again a partial knowledge. And much of what he has in the book is informed by the people he met, the people he employed to help carry his luggage, to help collect specimens. And so this dependency, again, we have this movement across the botanical color line of indigenous and African people helping the botanists. But it's also important to remember, I think, that information was withheld, and it was withheld as a means of negotiation. So if you're a Native American in some kind of treaty with the British, you do not want to hand over all your knowledge. Your knowledge you recognize is valuable to them, so you want to be selective and piecemeal about passing that information on. And the same with African Americans, and we see the same with enslaved Africans. And we see this happening again and again where botanists complain that they're not able to access sufficient information from the people they're traveling with. So Catesby's book is really stunning, and we learned from this why the passenger pigeon went extinct, because he talks about people shooting them in huge numbers and knocking them down from their nests at night, from their roosts at night in great numbers. But he's reliant on a Canadian Indian who tells him that he had seen, to understand more about their migratory patterns. And the Canadian Indian said he saw them in nests far north of the River Lawrence, and where he hunted them. The toothache plant, toothache tree, is an example of a native cure. And here Catesby writes, the leaves smell like those of orange, which with the seeds and leaves, and with the bark, is aromatic, very hot and astringent, and is used by the people inhabiting the sea coasts of Virginia and Carolina for the toothache, which is given it its name. So by that reference to peoples inhabiting the sea coast of Virginia and Carolina, those would be enslaved Africans, from whom he learns about this cure. And the Casino Yapon, I just want to show you how much he writes on this plant. And he's very fascinated by this use in Native American ceremonies. It is a caffeinated plant, but it's one that is part of social life, very much social life, amongst the Indian peoples. And they drink it in great quantities. Sometimes it induces them to vomit, so it's a means of cleansing. He writes, they say it restores lost appetite, strengthens the stomach, giving them agility and courage in war. And so again, he's very reliant on the information he's getting from the Cherokee or the Native Americans who he's traveling with for this information. In terms of the black walnut, he writes that, and this is where I think he drifts into a kind of disparaging references, and so he says the kernels of the walnut tree are very oily and rank, so they're very distasteful tasting. Yet when laid by some months, eat by Indians, squirrels, etc. So that juxtaposition of Indians and squirrels, I think, is very telling. And also with this plant, the annona, which looks like mango or pawpaw, but apparently it's not. But it may be a mis-illustration here. But the annona really refers to a genus of fruit that's rather like a sugar apple. And the description of it doesn't sound quite right for the pawpaw, but he says here, all parts of the tree have a rank, if not a fetid smell, nor is the fruit relished, but by very few except Negroes. So here again, the association of one people with an undesirable fruit is, I think, an indication of disparagement. But Catesby, so his accomplishments was one of the first to draw birds in their natural habitat alongside plants on which they depended. But he is extracting information and plants from a wider context of indigenous life and ecology, and to make the colony look Edenic, So the Governor Nicholson, also wanted Catesby's participation because he was trying to attract further settlers to South Carolina. And he knew that work by Catesby and other botanists would make the colony more appealing, both in terms of the amount of produce they could extract or farm or benefit from, but also by depicting a sort of Edenic environment. So it takes something from its natural context and confers a new ownership on it. In this way, it authorizes colonial dispossession. So our final figure, John Stedman, the Joker, again was untrained, but was always encouraged as a child to draw. And this is one of the few extant known drawings of his. It's the only one we have that provided material for the engravers for his book, Journey to Suriname. And here you can see, and it's a really appealing drawing, really attractive drawing technically, and it's full of interesting information. And what Stedman would have done was to leave these drawings with engravers, and they would reinterpret them, send back the proofs, and Stedman would criticize them, require corrections, adjustments. And I doubt he was very happy with this particular version of it. He's shown having 4 enslaved people helping him here. One is serving him water in a calabash. One is drying his clothes over a fire. They will have made this shelter for him, strung up the hammock. One is blowing the fire to keep it alight. And another is simply crouching down on his haunches, smoking a pipe. Stedman was interested in everything. He is just a total omnivore. He was fascinated by the environment, fascinated by adventure, constantly getting into duels and fights and arguments. But he found time to draw plants and just wanted to make as much, to gather in as much information as he could about the country. But he also drew native people and enslaved people. The other botanists that we saw did not do this. And these drawings, I think, are very empathetic. So one of the engravers that was employed to do the work was William Blake. And Blake did the engraving on the right. And Stedman also, which is pretty extraordinary, draws both the maroon example of a maroon slave, an escaped slave, set up the rebel communities in the forest, and one of the rangers, or so-called free Negro brigades, who were employed by the Dutch. They were given their freedom and some land if they would fight for the Dutch against the maroon communities. And Stedman depicts both. And I think in terms of, I'm trying to summon up voices that have been silenced, and this is a fantastic account by Stedman repeats verbatim in the book. No doubt it's been embellished, but so this is a meeting between Maroons and commissioners from the governor who are requiring some kind of cessation of hostilities. And so the Maroon leader replies, we desire you, addressing the commissioners, to tell your governor and your court that in case they want to raise no new gangs of rebels, they ought to take care that the planters kept a more watchful eye over their own properties, and not so often treat them in the hands of a parcel of drunken managers and overseers who, by wrongfully whipping the Negroes, debauching their wives and children, neglecting the sick, etc., the ruin of the colony, and willfully drive to the woods such quantities of stout, handsome people who by their sweat got your subsistence, without whose hands your colony must drop to nothing, and to whom at last in this pitiful manner you were glad to come and ply for friendship. Yeah, that isn't a more, speaking from a position of relative power, I don't know what is. But actually Blake is responsible for this engraving on the left. Stedman spends a lot of time attending to the treatment of enslaved people, and here there's a group of enslaved people coming off a ship on their way to auction, on the way to the sale. But on the right is one of a number of examples of the punishment of slaves, for, in this case, for a very minor infraction. This woman has to carry a weight around for a long time. And there are far more violent and horrific examples that Stedman has in his book. I don't care to reproduce them here, but you can look for yourself. And William Blake did a number of these drawings himself. There are drawings also of fighting. In this case, the Dutch soldiers are working their way through a swamp with a guide. But I just want to point out in the upper left corner are maroon fighters high up in the palm trees who are shooting down on the soldiers. Of course, they were completely outwitting the colonizing forces through their knowledge of the forest and their ability for guerrilla warfare. In the right, probably Stedman lamenting finding the skulls of 7 of his comrades who were killed by the Maroons. And here, this is a portrait of Stedman, again, probably rather idealized. Stedman maintained, he had a real love of nature and wanted to, really disliked having to kill any creature unless it was in defense or for food, and claimed when he was in battle that he would close his eyes when he was shooting so he didn't actually hit anybody. But he's depicted here having killed a Maroon soldier in the battle for the one battle he was in. Out of 7 excursions into the forest, 1 battle, Gadosabi, they successfully destroyed a Maroon compound, and you can see it in flames perhaps in the back just above the Maroon's thigh there. And this poem he writes is kind of extraordinary. From different parents, and the book is full of poems of this kind, from different parents, different climes we came, at different periods, he and the Maroon. Right? Fate still rules the same. Unhappy youth while bleeding on the ground, 'twas yours to fall, but mine to feel the wound. In a way, ridiculous though this is, Stedman frequently repeats his love of Africans and of indigenous people. He greatly admires their expertise in all manner of areas. And so that kind of respect he has, I think, brings them across the botanical color line and to some extent, and shows a very unusual example of a white person understanding the circumstances under which these people are having to live in the colony. And I want to close, I think, with one example of how sarcastic his descriptions can be. And here he's describing a Dutch plantation owner, depicted here again by William Blake, being served by an enslaved person in the back. His worship now saunters out in his morning dress, which consists of a pair of the finest Holland trousers. On his head is a cotton nightcap, and over that an enormous beaver hat that protects his image, his meager visage from the sun, while his whole carcass seldom weighs above 8 or 10 stone, being generally exhausted by the climate and dissipation. To give a more complete idea of this fine gentleman, I, in the annex plate, present him to the reader with a pipe in his mouth, which almost everywhere accompanies him, and receiving a glass of Madeira wine and water from a female quadroon slave to refresh him during his walk. And by far one of the more controversial aspects of the book concerns his relationship with Joanna, who was an enslaved woman. He wasn't able to free her. He never had the money to be able to purchase her. But he was engaged in what was called a Suriname marriage with her. Joanna's mother brought her to Stedman, as was fairly customary at that time, and said, if you pay me a certain amount of money, my daughter will live with you as a wife for the time you're here. And he agreed to this, but and this is all clear in his diary. And he says, well, everyone was doing this, even priests in Suriname were doing this. He clearly has a lot of affection for her. It's less clear how she feels for him, but in Stedman's book, the published book, he turns this into a love affair, and so much so that the book became an incredible literary success in Europe in the early 1800s. Stedman died a year after it was published. He didn't learn about that success, but it was largely due to this romantic relationship, this idealized relationship, which in a way, of course, completely misrepresents the relationship between colonizer and colonized, or colonizer and enslaved. But nevertheless, so we're dealing with at least three books here. His diary, which is a really frank and abbreviated book, really fascinating to read, full of swearing against soldiers, officers, plantation owners, damn this, bastard this, so on. And then the published book that we have in the library here, which is a compromise between Stedman's version and the publisher's idea, publisher wanting to avoid the accusation of sedition, which for all of Stedman's criticisms of slavery, the publisher was worried that he would be prosecuted by the British government. So that's all watered down. Nevertheless, Stedman was able to reach some kind of compromise between the publisher and himself. And also Stedman's book, which exists in, I think, University of Minneapolis Library, but has been published in its entirety as a Stedman's version, which is somewhere between the diary and the published book. So it's a very interesting story about the history of that book. And so again, my question then would be, how are we to regard these illustrations today, at least the ones we saw previously to the botanical illustrations? And I think, clearly they are advertisements for colonization, advertisements indirectly in some ways for slavery. Stedman himself actually was not an abolitionist. He supported slavery. He just felt that enslaved people were treated really badly. And ironically, his book, is great, but his book was used as an abolitionist text because of the frankness of his descriptions. So it served a purpose to which he would have been surprised. William Blake was, I believe, an abolitionist, and he and Blake developed a very strong friendship during the process of producing the book. But I think an argument might be made, I'm not sure how to make it, for the illustrations in the book existing as compensatory images in a way, so that display of Eden that we see in Catesby and to some extent Marion, although I think the image of predation of Marion's with the spiders is more complex. But that idea of an image that exceeds its needs. So these images inform, but they also exist to sell the book, so the more beautiful they are, the more subscribers they're likely to attract. But they also exist, I think, as a way to compensate for the history that enables them to exist in the first place. And so I would be interested to have a discussion, be involved in a discussion about that action, of the quality of the artwork in some way, overcoming all the circumstances that generated it, while at the same time, of course, and the more complicated these discussions are, the better, I think, at the same time being an indirect advocate for those conditions out of which the book grew. And I'll just close there. So thank you very much. And I'm happy, of course, to answer any questions or requests for further information.
What about, does John Bartram come up in any of these discussions?
He does. I think he's known to Catesby, of course. Yeah. And Bartram was
He's wandering around.
Fantastically important. And his son, maybe even more so, because his son produces a book of his own, a botanical book of his own. Is a very interesting figure, William Bartram. But Bartram was the key, the pivot for all of the botany that was being shipped to England, particularly through Peter Collinson.
And Linnaeus, too.
And then, yeah.
What was the end result of his story? So he had a wife, who was a slave. What happens in the end to him? Does he
Joanna.
go to England? Yeah.
Sloane wanted her to come to England, but
He returns to England.
he wanted her to come with him.
Stedman.
Oh, Stedman, sorry, Stedman. But she was sensible enough to know that this was not going to work out, and that she would be less than a second-class citizen in England and disparaged by everybody. And she chose to stay in Suriname. But even then, the question of whether he could have afforded to bring her to liberate her and bring her to England, that's unanswered. They had a child, and Stedman did take the child to England and brought up the boy and loved him very much. But another factor in actually the publication of the book was by the time in the cleaning up the book for his publisher was that by that time Stedman was married with a family of his own. Besides the child he had with Joanna, an English wife. And he wanted to paint a more rosy light on his dissolute life in Suriname. He didn't really want all the affairs he'd had with plantation owners' wives and with enslaved women to be publicly discussed. So he sanitizes the book really to protect his family. His son sadly dies at sea. He becomes a seaman. And so in a way, he I think in a way joins the military like his father and Stedman's father before him. But he dies as a young man, and Stedman lives to experience that and writes a very moving poem about his son's death. But Joanna dies in Suriname. Yeah.
repeat your question, or what you said you'd be interested in the conversation about how this was, I'm not sure I can repeat it exactly.
Yeah.
That this work was, these, paintings, all this information that they were gathering was in some ways enabling and continuing, the bad things that were happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
But
at the same time they were doing something else.
What you saw as the tension there?
Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing with Hans Sloane. So Hans Sloane is currently a villain because of he married into plantation wealth. He became a wealthy man and probably paid for the publication of his book himself. He married a Jamaican heiress of a plantation. So it's very easy to villainize him, but I'm more interested in complicated stories. And so for that reason, I wanted to dwell somewhat on the medical history, his treatments in Jamaica, which show a certain degree of empathy. And he felt, so unlike other doctors, Sloane felt that, I will come back to that, but Sloane felt that, that regardless of race, regardless of gender and age, everybody had the same disease, the same illness, the same infection. And so deserved the same treatments, the same medicines. So in that sense, he was very different from other doctors of his time who said, well, no, Africans, they don't experience the disease or pain in the same way. We don't have to treat them in the same manner. So I think that Sloane, all these people are very complicated people, and there are many ways into this body of work. I think that, Sloane's images, I'm interested in them. I'm not as excited about them as I am with Merriam's, and I'm probably, and Stedman's, but I'm interested in Catesby's too. But I think that artworks themselves are complicated things. On the one hand, they are just things in themselves that are somewhat lawless, and we have to give them credit for that autonomy, we might say, but they're also subject to all kinds of factors and influences, and we need to study that as well. And these are amazing works, right? They're some of the key works of the 1700s, and they can be beautiful to look at. And that puts us in an awkward position because we know what they came out of. We know they were enabled by colonization, slavery. So do we condemn them outright? Yeah, we can do. Perhaps that's appropriate. So how do we look at them now? We have to look at them with that knowledge, but we also have to credit that these artists were really genuinely interested in these specimens, in this botany. They were not just journeymen. They were there fascinated by what they were depicting and were providing in excess of the information required to understand and appreciate the plants and flowers and insects that they were drawing.
Yeah, and I have a second question. Feel free not to answer this at all. It's a more personal one because you talked about your journey into all of this being in some ways an accounting, as it were, for your own history, your own family. And many of us have family roots in history that are complicit in this kind of thing, in slavery. So I wonder if you want to talk about it, how this affected you doing this work, and does it seem in some way to help you with that accounting?
I don't know. I mean, I started the work before I realized the extent of my family's history, and before I went to Nevis, before I looked at the archives of British slave ownership, which are published online now, so you can type in your family name, and it tells me exactly how many people my family had enslaved at the point of compensations for the emancipation of the slaves. It was a lot of people, and I spent some time working on a family tree, putting in the compensation figures next to names, and I could see that, it was clear anyway, but I could see it was visually clear to me how that wealth that came from plantation wealth and compensations came all the way down to my great-grandfather, who was set up private businesses in Trinidad. And the myth in our family, who never talked about this at all, was that he was a self-made wealthy man. But there's no way that's the case. He would have arrived with wealth. He moved from St. Vincent to Trinidad. There were already relatives in Trinidad. So it came down indirectly to me. I mean, through all the privileges that I've experienced and benefited from. My father was English, met my mother in Trinidad and so on. So, but it's curious to me, telling that my family never expressed much interest in this. I'm yeah, I'm interested because I don't know that I can account for it. I mean, I can't, but I think that I'm interested in trouble, deeply troubled, and I do think, what would I have done if it had been me, right? I have no way of knowing. But as I was saying, you're locked into these positions in a slave society, and the most you can do is to be empathetic, and it could have done was to be empathetic and behave in a kind manner, but that was probably not permitted you. So I'm disturbed by those inevitable facts. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, okay, like with the publishing, how do I want to say this? Why do you think, like, because of that history, that went on then, why do you think some publishing companies are afraid to, like, really put that detail in there, so, everybody can kind of, what went on then, and
Yeah.
especially, like, black people,
Yeah.
deserve to know about that history. And
Yeah.
what do you think you can do as far as, like, maybe getting in contact with these publishing companies so they can not be afraid of that history? Because, like, we deserve to know. Like, everybody
Yeah.
deserves to know.
Yeah.
And I think they do kind of hide some stuff. I have heard of some people not being able to get their books published because of some things
Right.
pertaining to, like,
Right.
situations like this.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm sure there are forms of censorship that obviously that continue today that are based on certain judgments made of the material in the book, and I think that's a form of censorship, a form of suppression that shouldn't happen. We're talking about a system here of wealthy individuals and patrons that were able to support these books. Many other accounts were never published at the time. Many other diaries were never published at the time. And in Stedman's case, particularly in Stedman's case, it was the end of the 1700s when slavery had not been yet, a slave trade had not been abolished. The British government, in this case, were very concerned about the abolitionists and the way that they might disturb the wealth that was flowing from the colonies to Britain. And so they were keen to suppress any publications that would speak out against slavery. And of course, Stedman's publisher was a kind of one who was involved in a certain amount of political agitation, but he wasn't an extreme agitator. And he wanted to be able to continue publishing. He didn't want to be shut down by the government. So the sedition laws would have taken him to court if they felt that this was part of a campaign against British government interests. So he was extremely wary about that, and that's why that book was sanitized for publication. I think now it's a challenge to find publishers. To some extent, all these books were self-published because all the writers had to raise money on their own, find subscribers before they could find someone to help with the publishing, printing and publishing. And I think we can do that today to some extent. We have means at our disposal, means to use that were unimaginable even 30 years ago. We can put our material online where it'll attract a wider readership than anything we could put in print.
But they made trillions of dollars off of slave trade, and it's so disrespectful. Like, I even read that they went to Australia, they bothered them blacks and got them out of, they put them in slave, they destroyed them. And it's it's so unfair that we can't go around the world and enjoy like we naturally were when, in the beginning of time, we were already hunters and explorers, and it's like,
Yeah.
I'm so disappointed that our history is destroyed.
Yeah. And this is the
I just gotta give you your respect for doing
Yeah.
this, because
Yeah.
I know it's not easy, especially being the race that you are, but it's just so disrespectful when, you get some honor and some nobility for doing this, and keep doing it, and maybe you can get other people of your race, to keep fighting for this, history and literature to be out, because I'm just so disappointed. The more history that I find out that's like hidden about us, like, it's so hurtful, especially around this whole globe, like how black people were, like, they were around the whole globe, and taken out of their countries, Europe,
Yeah.
like Sweden. I'm just like astonished, and they had me thinking like.
Well, you have to,
this one little group
please
black.
keep speaking out about it, and that's
Yeah.
very important. But I think we can see why that knowledge has been excluded from us. This is the whole attitude towards people of color was derogatory, and they were disqualified from contributing to the body of knowledge that these colonies have generated and benefited from.
Unless it could help you with your toe.
Hmm?
I said, unless it could help you with your toe.
Unless you're an African queen and help you with your toe, yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Mark, very much thanks to you. Wonderful program and a lot of insights. Thank you all for coming tonight. We'd like to invite you to explore the Lloyd Library more through our exhibitions, other programs, our collections, doing research like Mark has done as well. And for the artist in the group, remember we do have an artist in residence program, so you may want to consider applying for that. The deadline for 2025 is November 1. And for everyone, we encourage you to come back to our upcoming programs. You can find them listed on our website, social media, or on the back of our beautiful Flora Mania postcard, so feel free to grab one of those. Later this year and next, watch for our Photo Focus exhibition and program series in the fall entitled The Lore of the Pawpaw, with our 2024 artist in residence, photojournalist Madeline Hordinsky. And then in 2025, Mark will return to the Lloyd, and he'll be collaborating with us on a symposium where we hope to be getting some of the speakers that you introduced at the very first of the program. And that symposium is going to be the enduring impact of the African plant diaspora. Also, I'd like to just say that programs like this are supported in part by friends and members of the Lloyd Library. So if you're a member of the Lloyd Library, thank you. And if you're not, please consider joining us.